maybe this fancy-ass executive editor should take the time to read one singular collective bargaining agreement, because guarantees and control are actually almost universal, in fact.
Are you on? Which side are you on?
So there was this piece that I saw on Twitter that I wanted to respond to because it was about restaurants and unions. And, you know, I don't talk about it a lot, but I worked in a restaurant for 3 years, and I have something of a soft spot for workers in that industry because I think that they are particularly exploited, and, you know, the conditions that they have to face are particularly gross. And it's, you know, people always think about restaurants and service work as like, oh, this is a job that teenagers can, that children can do, that 14-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 15-year-olds should be able to do, right? That's kind of when you think of a job for children, you often think of restaurants and service. Despite the fact, and this is a fact, that there is no other industry in the country, none, with a higher incidence of sexual harassment. So, you know, I worked there when I was young. I worked there when I was 18. I was legally an adult, but there were people there that worked younger than me. And it's, you know, generally most of the time it probably will be fine, but it's something that if you have worked in the restaurant industry for any length of time, if you have not been sexually assaulted, you know somebody that has, right? You know somebody that has gone through something like this. And so, obviously, restaurant workers make just pitiful amounts of money. They do not make nearly enough for as hard as they work. And I think they deserve more. I think they deserve a lot more. But that is not a universally held opinion, apparently. There's a movement underway in the Twin Cities in Minnesota to organize restaurants by Unite Here. And that's the trigger for this article by a fellow named Adam Platt. His name is Adam Platt. He is the executive editor of a fancy business magazine, who vigorously insists in his communications with me that he is not anti-union, but nevertheless has thoughts. I'm not anti-union, but I have thoughts. And so he opens the article by saying that, and the article is titled, if you really want to read it, Restaurants versus Unions and the City. He opens the article by saying that his soon-to-come take is informed by, quote, conversations across industry, government, and organized labor to understand what's going on. And he reiterates that all of what follows come from people at the center of these universes. And so that really makes you think that, oh, this guy has a real thumb on the pulse, right, of what's going on in the restaurant sector, including among people in unions and people who have voted for unions. And so you got to think like, wow, this guy really is going to know his stuff, and he's really going to represent both sides of the argument very charitably and make sure that everybody's represented well. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler warning before I jump right into it and say that although you will get a pretty extensive quote from one business owner alongside hand-wringing that other restaurant owners don't want to talk because they're afraid of their employees, no worker who you will notice in his telling is some big powerful entity in the Twin Cities, the big powerful big restaurant worker is quoted or even so much as paraphrased, right? He presents some of his opinions as basically something that, oh, this is what the restaurant owners would say if they weren't so scared of their workers. But there's not even an attempt. There's no attempt to relay to the reader the reasons that restaurant workers say they are organizing. He will make some prognostications about why the unions are interested in organizing. He talks, and basically it's kind of the stuff that you're going to hear a lot actually in anti-union talking points. Oh, the only reason they're organizing is to get more dues payers because they're losing members in other sectors of the industry. They just want more dues payers. It's about keeping business up as a union. It's not that people are coming to them wanting to organize, and it's certainly not that workers in the industry are independently interested in having a voice on the job. That can't be it. And so he doesn't even kind of attempt to, there's no quote or paraphrase from a worker, even from a press release where a worker is quoted, right? No attempt to represent the workers who voted in favor of unionizing. They just don't exist in his telling of the story. And it's very frustrating to me. It's very frustrating. And I mentioned that he's had communications with me because I invited him on the show to talk about this. And he said, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically like, again, he does this stuff like, I'm not anti-union and I don't want to be set up as a capitalist foil or whatever, on behalf of business. I have my opinions and I'll, and they are what they are. But if you want like a capitalist foil or whatever, you should talk to a business owner. And it's like, I just want to talk to you about the words that you put on the table, right? I mean, and if you think that makes you look like a capitalist foil, then maybe that should encourage you to do some introspection. But, so I say, I'm very upfront with him. I don't, and if I had been less upfront with him, I could have gotten him on the show and it would have been an entertaining segment. But I do want to be honest. I don't want to lie. I don't want to lie, in public or in private, to people. So I didn't. And I told him that, I would expect the conversation to be adversarial. And I told him explicitly, quote, in my email, I question the extent to which you've engaged in good faith with the position of organizing workers. I did say that, of course, I'll give you opportunities to talk. I gave him some clips from some other like debates that we've done. But yeah, he said, I'm going to decline. You really need somebody from the business or hospitality community to represent that perspective, not me. And I don't really want to occupy that role. He said, our magazine is produced for and subscribed to by a business audience, not a general audience or a social justice audience. I wrote the column with my audience in mind. And I feel I was fair to unite here. I do not. And again, there he is. He says, I was fair to unite here. Again, no mention of the workers. He's third-partying the union. It's as if the people organizing are just being, marionetted by Unite Here, this outside entity, right? But did not go out of my way to articulate the union perspective. That much is clear for sure. And I'm not interested in justifying to you or an audience how I structured my story or whether it was fair to either side. I have restaurateurs mad at me about it as well, I might add. That is an interesting claim. I'm going to press X to doubt on that one. And, he goes on to say, oh, maybe it's different in Alabama. Maybe workers here in Minnesota are just like super well compensated and you don't understand what it's like, basically. So, So yeah, there you go. That was my conversation with him. Unfortunately, he's not willing to, represent. He's not willing to defend his takes, and so that's unfortunate. But that is what it is. So here we go. Here's his article. Parts of his. I'm obviously not going to read the whole thing. If you really want to read the whole thing, you can go read it yourself. But I wanted to pull out some of the things that I took issue with. Unions represent a small minority of American workers. Their offerings have typically held little allure in restaurants, which have high turnover and mostly short-term part-time workers interested in maximizing tips and minimizing hours. Restaurant work has been an invaluable haven for people earning money to fund a transition to an adult career, but the industry supports career track jobs as well in management or tip roles at high-end restaurants. And so just here, unions' offerings have typically held little allure in restaurants, which have a high turnover and mostly short-term part-time workers interested in maximizing tips and minimizing hours. And, I don't know what he thinks the dynamics are in other industries, but the dynamic of wanting more money for less work is like the kind of quintessential working class demand. Right? That's that's like literally the whole entire thing is that workers want more money for less work and employers want more work for less money. Like that's the whole literal class divide. And that doesn't change just because these workers, it doesn't change the dynamic because most of their wages are coming from tips rather than wages. And so that's kind of a perplexing supporting argument for saying that, restaurant workers don't want or deserve or need unions. It's very strange. As opposed to maybe considering the idea that, workers in restaurants in the United States are not unionized because of the kind of severe repression of organized labor and the lack of, legal support for workers who want to engage in organization and the lack of protections against retaliation for stuff like that. No, it's just because independently themselves, the workers have decided, again, that they don't want like a steady income. They don't want regular hours. They don't want job security. They don't want to say they're just totally not interested in that. They're interested in maximizing tips and minimizing hours, which is completely different from every other worker. He says Unite Here has set its sights on creating more full-time restaurant jobs by attacking the long-held practice of flexible scheduling. Efforts to unionize one of the restaurants. He quotes some of the restaurants' attempts to unionize that have been successful, some unsuccessful. And in response, owners are lawyering up, spending $1,000 an hour on specialists who promise to keep Local 17 at bay. And, here again, it seems like here's an opportunity for introspection, because later on in the article, he's going to do the whole woe is me, like, oh, this restaurant closed after it unionized because of the union, and there's even more complications to that as well. These poor restaurants are not making enough money, but they have enough money to pay $1,000 an hour to these specialists. I mean, that could fund, like, 30 people an hour, right? I mean, that's crazy. That's just a absurd, crazy amount of money that they're spending on keeping the union at bay. And when they could just spend that on paying people more or making the schedule more, like tending to the demands of the workers. Instead, they want to spend this money so that they retain their power over these workers. He says the industry attracts a front-of-house workforce that values the ability to work as much or as little as they choose and to take lots of time off to pursue passion projects or education. And so, here again, I don't want to discount the idea that there are going to be differences in industries across regions, right? Or even in different sectors of an industry within a region. But, the idea that that most restaurant workers can just take off as much as they choose, right? For any reason, that's was not exactly my experience. My experience was that if you were not able to work and you couldn't get your shift covered, then you either had to go into work or you would risk discipline and ultimately termination for that, right? And also, the restaurant that I worked at for 3 years, I worked at when I was 18 years old, and I was the only person in this restaurant who was not paying rent, right? That was a kind of crazy dynamic to me because this was not a high-end restaurant that I was working at. It was just a middle-of-the-road burger joint, fast casual kind of stuff. And everybody that worked there besides me was having to pay rent. So I'm sure that they would have valued a steady income. So here again, he's just making strange arguments and that just not engaging with the workers, with their perspective. Here's another one. Ask a tipped restaurant employee if they would rather stick out a slow shift at minimum wage or get cut. The uniform answer is get cut. Obviously, that's my word. This reality makes union heads explode. But I've been asking this question of restaurant workers all year. The frustrated workers that Local 17 channels in its PR and friendly media coverage are outliers, people who have chosen the wrong kind of job for their needs. And so, I wish that he had a quote here to justify this statement that union organizers and activists and supporters are just totally bumfuzzled by the idea that a minimum wage worker would rather get cut than stay on through a slow shift in an industry where the majority of their wages are coming from tips.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
You know, it's like, what union person is like, who doesn't understand that dynamic? You know, I mean, this crazy. I really wish he had a quote. I mean, maybe there's one you know, there's all sorts of people out there, so maybe there's one person, but I really wish we had a quote for this, because that's kind of a obvious dynamic, right? Who doesn't understand that? So here's another one. Kim's was losing money. Kim's was a restaurant. Kim's was losing money before it unionized and just announced it is going out of business at the end of August. Did Local 17 believe more rigidity and overhead would fix the problems of an exceptional restaurant trying to make it in a deserted commercial neighborhood? I mean, really, this restaurant, really entrepreneurial spirit kind of stuff here, really trying to make it, we're trying really hard, you know, this kind of stuff. And just the poor entrepreneur or business owner, you know, their workers are just forcing more rigidity and overhead, you know. And so what does that communicate to you, Adam, when you read this? When you say, did Local 17 believe more rigidity and overhead would fix the problems? What does that kind of imply to you?
Well, I would assume that Local 17 enforced some rigidity and overhead.
Right. Like as if there was a contract in place or something, right?
Yeah, that was very rigid. And somehow increased costs.
Yeah, and had higher wages for people. Or maybe something like this, right? That's kind of the implication that I got, too. And so I was like, oh, man, that's interesting. That's a bummer. But, you know, sometimes these things happen. But, yeah, that's the implication. That's the kind of thought that you're left with in your head, that Local 17, they won a union election, they got a contract, they made things more rigid, and they increased overhead by increasing wages. And poor Kim's, they just couldn't cut it,
and that's what closed it.
And that's why it closed. He doesn't tell you that actually the union had not even had a chance to share their bargaining proposals. That's super interesting. So here from Workday Magazine, an outlet that's actually, you know, kind of interested in, you know, interviewing workers. The title of this article by Amy Stagger is called, quote, "I Know My Worth, What It Takes to Unionize the Service Industry." And they quote a worker. They say, quote, "Why did the company close Kim's before we'd even had a chance to share our bargaining proposals?" said Kim's back-of-house supervisor, Alice Calder, in a press release from Local 17. Quote, "If the closure isn't about busting the union or punishing union supporters, there's no excuse not to hire us at Young Johnny, Pizzeria Lola, or Hello Pizza, or put us on preferential hiring lists until spots comes up." Because Kim's is owned by a person that not only owns that one restaurant, but as you can tell, a suite of restaurants of all varieties. And so, because they did, and so the dynamic here is that the union unionized, they won a union election, and they had not even begun bargaining. So literally nothing had changed yet before they closed. There was no increased rigidity. There was no increased overhead costs, no increased wages, nothing. They had just won a union election and had not even been able to begin bargaining yet. So because they are union, the company is going to have to bargain with them over the effects of the closures, and the union is going to be trying to get these people to get the company to hire them at some of their other restaurants when spots come up. But the restaurant is balking at this because very clearly, even if maybe it's possible the financials were not great, but clearly the primary motivator was union busting for closing the restaurant, right? That's very clear by their actions. So back to this anti-union piece. Kim's workers had demands that were typical of the era, less about traditional themes like wages and benefits than about guarantees and control. Guarantees and control are actually traditional themes. Yeah. Maybe this fancy-ass executive editor of a fancy-ass business journal should take the time to read one singular collective bargaining agreement, because guarantees and control are actually ubiquitous. They're almost universal, in fact. I'm having trouble thinking about a union contract that would not include some form of guarantees and control. Back to the piece. They don't like the inconsistency of income that rises and falls on the variables of business. They also increasingly want a role in the managing of the business. That means input on decisions like where the company sources milk, or whether pro-Palestine pins can be worn at work. Cafe Surrey's front of house workforce, the only cohort being organized, earns between $23 and $30 per hour with tips, and they pay 80% of health insurance premiums with a deductible. So, trying to make it seem like, because they make this amount of money in the Twin Cities, which has a much higher cost of living than Huntsville, they don't deserve a union, is kind of the implication there. So here's the one place where he does quote a business owner. And it's interesting that this is the place that this is the actual input that he does get from a business owner. And this is from a business owner that does have union restaurants in hotels. And this business owner says that the cost of doing business in his union restaurants are only marginally more expensive than in his non-union operations. That's interesting. He has not been pushed into fixed scheduling, but has rules about when employees can be cut during a shift. Not unreasonable. And his biggest frustration is that seniority controls the workplace because unions try to eliminate prerogatives of subjectivity. Again, not unreasonable. Graves says, the business owner, it's tough to reward high performers in a union environment, but suggests operators focus their energies on working with Local 17 rather than fighting it. So that's a pretty reasonable perspective from Mr. Business Owner right there. And so Mr. Fancy, executive editor of a fancy business journal, he closes out the piece by saying that unions serve a vital role in American life, but there's a difference between protecting people's dignity and attempting to impose a new model on a sector whose workers are already well compensated as unskilled labor goes. And to be clear, there are restaurants in town that offer career track jobs and fixed scheduling for those who want that. But not every job can or should be a career. And I think the question to ask there is, why not? He says disaffected 20-somethings who will be in grad school next year do not have standing to tell the owner who the milk vendor or general manager would be, or to believe they are entitled to a career track job within walking distance of their home, all demands I've heard in the last few months. Workplace power and control come with experience and dedication, and the people who risk the most are reasonably entitled to make the decisions that affect a business's viability. And obviously, even in union workplaces, business owners have more of a say than workers. But yes, you should have to give up some amount of control over an enterprise if you have to hire other people, right? If you want total 100% control, do it totally 100% yourself. Do it yourself. If you got to have other people to do it, they deserve a say. Some amount of control. And the more people that you have to include in the operation of an enterprise to make the operation of your enterprise possible, the less power and control that you should have as an individual business owner. And so it's very good that these people are unionizing restaurants in the Twin Cities. Hope it continues in the Twin Cities, and I hope it expands. But yeah, people like this are very frustrating, especially when they're not willing to just come out and say, like, I am anti-union. Because all of this throat-clearing BS that he does is just BS. And you can tell from what he wrote, right? I mean, this is a guy that is very clearly has some sort of, he thinks the kids are uppity or whatever, and they don't deserve it. And, right. he should just be out about that and say that, no, I don't believe in unions as a principle. I don't believe that workers deserve control or a voice on the job as a principle. Some workers I like, maybe if they have hard hats or they're big burly white guys, right? Maybe they deserve some amount of control, but that's just because I like these workers particularly. Like, they look nice to me. I like to look at them. They make me feel good, right? But these other workers who look weird, or some of them are women, or some of them are maybe like LGBT, some of them are people of color, I don't know. I feel weird around them. They seem kind of uppity. I don't think they deserve, so that's just kind of the way that I operate. I don't have a principle that people who work deserve some amount of control. These people, they make me feel good. These other people, they make me feel not good. So, the ones that make me feel good, they deserve stuff. The ones who don't, they don't. And that's how I work. And he should just be upfront about that.
Right. I've never understood people who feel like certain jobs should be less than other jobs.
Right.
And that's not to say that, like starting tomorrow, everybody should get paid the exact same wage at every single job, I'm not trying to imply that right at this second. What I'm concerned about is that we have folks who think that, restaurant jobs should just be crappy jobs, right? With no benefits, crazy scheduling, dangerous conditions, hostile, abusive conditions, that those things are just, it's just part of the territory, right? Because that's this fella's position really is, his rhetoric about, wrapping up the article with the pro-union stuff is more or less like you're saying that there are some workers he can see where maybe it makes sense for them, right? And I hear that talking point sometimes. People say, well, maybe a union makes sense for those factory workers over there or for those construction workers over there, but not for these office workers or not for these restaurant workers or not for these nurses or these teachers or, insert category of workers here. And I've just, I don't understand those divisions because, if you've got a boss, if you don't own the place and you've got a boss, you're a worker and you should have a union. Like unions are a tool that we use to improve our lives. Most immediately in the workplace, but in the broader community as well. So I don't see why restaurant jobs can't be good union jobs. There was a time in this country, decades ago where it was much more common for folks to be able to live off of one job, sustainably. In fact, one income per family often without with little education. And that was thanks to the power of unions, the influence of unions in this country, where folks could, drop out of high school, go get a job at a factory or even in restaurants or other industries and make a decent enough living, right? And pensions were more common, benefits were more common. So those are some issues that come to my mind. I don't see why restaurant jobs have to be second class. And, I think folks make a mistake to assume that, well, it's just going to be kids that are working in these restaurants. That's never been my experience, that it's just kids. Even in fast food, it's not just kids. For one thing, they're open during the school day. I mean, just to put it out there on a practical matter. But yeah, there are plenty of folks, this is how they make a living. And I think that anyone who goes to work should be able to, at least sustain a decent enough life for themselves. Like, there shouldn't be jobs that pay poverty wages. Just bottom line. I mean, doesn't matter what it is. If it's a busboy or a server or a fry cook, doesn't matter. There shouldn't be jobs paying poverty wages. So, yeah, I encourage restaurant workers to organize. I think that is the path forward. Union of Southern Service Workers is doing some really cool stuff down here in the South, and I'm excited to see their growth and, organizing in places like Waffle House. So, that's the path forward, whether it's, a high-end restaurant talking about servers and stuff like that, or, fast food, fast casual, whatever. The path forward is for workers to organize collectively. And yes, they are going to fight very, very hard against it because the restaurant industry is traditionally anti-union and non-union. So it's going to be an uphill fight. But if we want restaurant jobs to be good jobs, that's how we do it. We unionize. Now, the specter of automation, I think, is out there. And they always float that out there. Oh, well, if you increase wages in the restaurant industry, there will be robot burger flippers. Okay. I'm not, scared about that. If the other jobs in the restaurant industry pay a living wage, right? If if jobs pay living wages, automation is not as scary. Automation is scary because we don't currently have any control or influence over it. And so we have no way of protecting our jobs absent our union contracts. So, yeah, interesting fellow, interesting guy. I'm not surprised he didn't come on the show. But bottom line, restaurant workers do need to organize. It is the best path forward, and we have to organize everywhere. And something that, this reminds me of is the UAW interview we had this morning, talking about, they talk to anybody who comes by the union hall, anyone in town, right?
Right.
And we, you and I are both familiar enough with some of the history of the UMWA, the Coal Miners Union here in Alabama. And I mean, they unionized basically all of Walker County.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody who worked in the county just about was organized by the Coal Miners Union, even school principals. So, that's the sort of approach we need. And I think it's really cool that in Minneapolis, there's a strong labor movement. They've been doing coordinated bargaining and aligning their contracts. And so it's not a surprise to see this growth in the restaurant industry there with unions. But that's where we need to do, those strategic approaches and really leverage the unions we already have to bust into new industries.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.